Yuya startled awake. He wasn't entirely sure why, but he was awake now, staring at the ceiling of the covered wagon. His body ached from laying at such an awkward angle, folded up against the hard wood of the wagon, but at least he'd been able to sleep uninterrupted for a long time. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. "The wagon isn't moving," Yuto said groggily. "Did we stop?" Yuya rubbed at his eyes. Crow had fallen asleep across from Yuya, his arms folded over his chest, chin fallen against his collarbone. Reiji and the other two were nowhere to be seen, but Yuya could see the hint of firelight flickering from the edge of the wagon's opening, so they must have set up camp for the night. Yuya licked his dry lips and yawned, stretching. For a few moments he just sat there in the wagon. They'd been traveling for a few days now. Yuya kept falling asleep, so he wasn't entirely sure how many days, but it must have been about 2 or 3. Armageddon moved them along quickly and steadily. Crow said they were probably about 3 days out from the Old Woods, and somewhere in the Old Woods lay the Kokoro people, who hopefully knew where Rayglen and the goddess's champion was. Yuya's throat was dry. After sitting there just dealing with it for a few minutes, Yuri hissed at him to go get the canteen, and Yuya finally gave in. Crawling across the wagon to gingerly left the canteen from the floor beside Crow. He took a long drink, sighing as he let it back down onto his lap. His ears twitched, then. Was that singing? It was a faint, distant sound, as though someone were trying to sing too softly to be heard. Yuya caught the hint of a lute strumming softly, too. Was that Sawatari? He had been singing a lot on this adventure, constantly pestering Yuya to tell him more about his time at the temple and his escape. Yuya told him whatever he asked, but Crow always started to look sick and started having violent thoughts towards those Arcanian priests when he talked about it, so Yuya had been trying not to say anything else. Sawatari didn't need much to start scribbling ballads, though, and he would sing the story songs he had made up about Yuya in snippets as he thought them up. But that didn't sound like Sawatari's voice, not quite. Who was it? Yuya crawled to the end of the wagon, looking both ways in the dark. The fire was glimmering off to the right of the wagon, so he swung his legs over and hopped into the soft grasses. His eyes happened to flicker up, and he had to stop then, because he could only stare. Stars flooded the sky. Huge, sparkling white stars scattered like diamonds across a deep, velvet blue. He could see something like the edges of wispy, multicolored clouds swirling between the copses of stars. Yuya's mouth dropped open. He hadn't even looked up once during this journey yet. Or maybe he had been asleep when the night came. But this was... "It's so pretty," Yugo breathed. "There's so many stars." The other two were just as dumbfounded as Yuya, so they couldn't say a word. Yuya turned slowly, trying to see every inch of the sky above. He yelped when he heard a foot fall lightly in the grass behind him, and then the soft singing stopped abruptly and he spun. He spun so fast that he almost fell. Tsukikage lightly caught him by the shoulder, steadying him. Tsukikage's dark eyes glittered at Yuya. He blinked once, face inscrutable under his mask. "Tsukikage, is someone there?" That was Reiji's voice, Yuya realized. Tsukikage tapped on Yuya's shoulder and pointed towards the fire, head tilting. That was a question, wasn't it? "Come over to the fire," he seemed to be saying. Yuya let Tsukikage guide him around the wagon to the light of the fire. Reiji was the only one there. He sat on a small stump beside the fire, doing something in his lap. There were some kind of parts resting on the fabric spread over his knees, and he had a cloth in one hand, rubbing at something. Sawatari sat on the ground on the other side of the fire, fiddling with the knobs of his lute and muttering. Reiji glanced up. "Ah," he said. "Did I wake you?" The way he said it made Yuya think maybe he had been the one who was singing. "No," Yuya said. "I woke up on my own, I promise." Reiji nodded almost imperceptibly. His eyes lifted to Tsukikage. Tsukikage stepped away from Yuya so he could make a brief flurry of signs with his hands, and Reiji nodded. He tilted his head towards the fire. "Are you hungry? You haven't eaten much during the journey." Yuya opened his mouth to say no, he was fine, but then his stomach rumbled right on cue and he felt his cheeks flush. "Take the food if they're offering it," Yuri hissed at him. "Demons, Yuya, stop being such a wallflower." Yuya ducked his head. Yes," he whispered. Reiji beckoned him closer to the fire, and Yuya only hesitated a moment before creeping over. Sawatari smiled at him, but it was a distant, distracted smile, as his eyes went right back to his lute. He muttered something that might have been a swear in a language Yuya didn't know. Yuya sat awkwardly in front of the fire, between Reiji and Sawatari. Reiji put down the cloth and the part he was holding, and Yuya realized that it was the strange weapon he had used against the priests in Eclipse Scene. Reiji picked up a stick leaned against his legs and poked at the fire. Yuya realized then that there were little metal lumps in the blaze, and Reiji teased one out onto the ground. "Let it cool for a few minutes before you pick it up," he said. "The foil is hot." Yuya nodded. Reiji teased the other few lumps free with his stick, and then laid it down again. He picked up his cloth and one of the pieces on his lap, wiping it off with a quick movement. Yuya stared at his lap for a few moments, wondering what he could say, if anything at all. He said, making Reiji glance up. What is that?" Reiji glanced at the parts in his lap. "I'll show you," he said. "One moment, please." He tucked the cloth into the front pocket of his vest. Quickly, as though he were incredibly practiced, he slotted all of the pieces back together and flipped the weapon back up into his hand lightly. It was a sort of bent shape, with a handle that had a little switch right at Reiji's first finger. There was a long tube at the end of it, and some kind of spinning part just above the handle. "This is a pistol," he said. "You won't have seen one before. They're currently only in use as prototypes in making. Their muskets are a tad more reliable, but harder to conceal." He spun it once around his finger so that it landed in his hand with the handle facing towards Yuya. "You can look at it if you'd like." Yuya hesitated, but Reiji let it hang in the air. He wrapped his hands around it and took it gently. It was heavier than he thought it would be, he thought. How did you hold it? And what did it do? It's for hitting people with," he said. The handle looked like a bludgeon. Reiji shook his head. He held out his hand and Yuya handed it back. Reiji took it in his hand again, pressing his finger lightly against the switch. "It's currently unloaded, but it would normally be filled with small spheres called bullets," he said. "The mechanism uses gunpowder to apply force to the bullet, pushing it through the cylinder in such a way that it reaches many hundreds of thousands of miles per second in just a few moments." Yuya stared at it. Something that small could do that? Was that the banging he had heard before the priests had collapsed? And it shoots those at people? Reiji nodded. "It's a bit of a dangerous weapon," he said. He flipped the spinning part out and reached into his belt to start feeding small spheres into each hole. "And expensive. I don't have much ammunition for it." His eyes flickered back to Yuya as he flipped the now loaded spinning part back into the contraption and hid the weapon back under his cloak again. "I'm sure it's nothing like the weapons your priests use," he said. "I've heard very interesting things about them." His voice was low and flat, but Yuya could hear the flicker of thought in his head. He hadn't just heard of them, Yuya realized. He had seen them used, and he was furious about it. Yuya ducked his head. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Reiji blinked. "What for?" It's my fault that the weapons exist." Reiji closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he didn't look at Yuya. He leaned down towards the metal lumps on the ground, picking one up gingerly. When it seemed it wouldn't burn him, he lifted it up and peeled the metal back. Oh, they were thin sheets of metal around a potato. Reiji held the half-unwrapped potato to Yuya. Yuya hesitated before taking it. The metal was still warm, and steam rose up across his face. He closed his eyes just to enjoy it for a moment. It smelled nice. There was some kind of garlicky scent to it. Reiji picked up another one and handed it to Tsukikage, who appeared suddenly out of the shadows and then disappeared again with the potato. Yuya blinked. When Reiji caught his gaze, he just shrugged. "He doesn't like to eat around other people," he said. Yuya ducked his head. He hadn't been trying to be nosy. Reiji tried to give Sawatari one of the potatoes too, but Sawatari just swore in another language, stood up abruptly, and stormed off. "And he just gets into moods," Reiji said, rolling his eyes. He peeled the metal back from his own meal and blew on it softly. "You can have his potato." Yuya stared at his own meal for a few moments, but his stomach rumbled again, and he went to work biting into the softly baked potato. Demons. It tasted so good. He almost wanted to cry. It burned his tongue a bit, but he didn't care. For a moment, they just ate in silence, nothing but the faint buzz of insects filling the dark, starlit field around them. Yuya, Reiji said after a beat, you do not have to answer this if you don't feel comfortable. But how are the demon weapons made? Yuya swallowed another hot bite of potato. He almost choked on it and had to cough a few times before he could answer. Don't tell him, Yuri said. He'll get ideas. Yuri, shut up, Yugo said. Yuya glanced up briefly at Reiji. Reiji's dark violet eyes simply looked at him, level and calm, without a hint of emotion on his face. He might have been a statue, and his head was quiet. There was nothing destructive about his question. Was he just curious? Yuya licked the potato from his lips before answering. They're made with a special metal, he said. I don't know what the metal is, but it's always a really dark black after it's forged. They make them in the outer temple with the right runes for what they're supposed to do. Reiji nodded. I've come to know that bit, he said. But how is their power imparted? They say you bless them, but something tells me that there is something more than that. Yuya's stomach twisted. For a moment his brain flashed back to the altar and the chanting and the dimly torchlit room and Roger with his knife pressing into his skin. He didn't realize that he had briefly blacked out until he realized Reiji was holding him by the shoulders, whispering soothingly to him. Yuya fumbled for his words again. Sorry, he said. Sorry. It's all right. Breathe. I shouldn't have asked. Yuya shook his head. My blood, he managed to get out. They use my blood. They have to perform special rituals with it to make it hold to the metal longer, but my blood has special properties that passes my power into the weapons. Reiji's hands tightened on Yuya's shoulders, and for a moment, Yuya heard his mind crackle with anger. So, he said, monotone, that's how it works. He held onto Yuya's shoulders for a breath longer. Then he let go and stepped back to his stump, sitting down again and retrieving his fallen potato. He only stared at it for a long, long moment. Yuya swallowed. He felt sick now, but he really wanted to keep eating, so he did. He wondered why Reiji had wanted to know. You know, Reiji said after a beat, I think this world of ours, we rely too much on old magics. Yuya glanced up at him, but Reiji's gaze was elsewhere. He reached into his cloak again and pulled the pistol out, twisting it so that the firelight glanced off of it. He looked up and down its length. When I went to Mei Ying, I saw nothing of either goddess or demon there, he said. They're a proud people. They have a lot of pride in their factories and their technology. I tried to trade my enchanting scrolls with them, and they laughed at me. Scrolls, they said, could only be used by a handful of people, and they take months to write and forge. The real power was in their factories. He let the pistol drop down over his knees. I thought them strange back then. What kind of place did not make offerings to either goddess or demon? What kind of country left behind proven magics for unproven science, left behind the gods for humanity? His eyes slid to Yuya, and Yuya thought that maybe he could see the stars reflected in his eyes. But maybe they were the ones who were right, he said. Maybe it's time we let go of those older ways. They've brought much pain and suffering to us. To you. Yuya looked at the ground. I think that's probably good, he said. I don't want to be a demon. I want to disappear. Then humans can keep growing, right? This world doesn't need a demon anymore. Reiji made a soft, breathy sound, and Yuya wasn't sure if it was a laugh or a huff. You speak as though you aren't a human yourself. Because I'm not. Reiji just blinked at him. Then he sighed, standing up and rolling his shoulders. Tell me, Yuya, which part of you decided to flee from the horrors you experienced? The demon part or the human part? Yuya's mouth opened, but no sound came out. What kind of a question was that? He didn't even know what to say. Reiji spoke again, so he didn't have to come up with anything. I used to think poorly of humans, he said. I thought only the goddess was perfect, but now I see that the world she made isn't that perfect at all. He looked down at Yuya, calm and quiet. So I will believe in humans, he said. I will believe that we have the ability to fix the world. I will believe that the goddess made us for a reason, and that we have power that she did not. What power is that? Yuya said, feeling rapt all of a sudden. Reiji's eyes were as deep as the star-studded sky above, and Yuya thought, for a single, shuddering moment, that this must be what a leader looked like. The power to change ourselves. He folded up his now empty foil and set it beside the fire. I'm going to check on Armageddon. I suggest you get some rest. We'll be starting early again tomorrow. Yuya just nodded dumbly. Without another word, his scarf fluttering around him, Reiji turned and walked away into the night beyond the firelight. Yuya stared at his half-eaten potato. His thoughts clattered and spun. Even the voices in his head were quiet, thinking about things on their own. He took another bite of potato. Maybe things would make more sense in the morning.